I began to hear a voice after I was in a car accident when I was 7. I used to believe it was just survivor's guilt, but yesterday I learned the horrifying truth. Written by Pepperidge Farm Remembers. I've lived with the voice for 11 years now. 11 years since I first heard the pained whispers drift up from the back of my mind. 11 years since the accident. I don't remember much from before the wreck. Probably about the same amount any person does from their first 7 years of life. But I do recall every detail of the day that everything changed for me. Maybe the trauma of it all seared into my memories. My mother was driving me home from soccer practice, and some of her hair was draped over the back of the headrest. I was seated behind her, and when she refused to stop for ice cream, I grabbed a handful of the blonde strands and tugged hard. Distracted for a moment by the sudden pain in her scalp, and turning to yell at me, she ran a red light. I'll never forget the look of terror on the young woman's face in the other car as she was about to T-bone us, nor her screaming expression turning towards the back seat just before the collision. My father was on the board of the highest-rated hospital in the city, and he ensured that we received the best surgeons and the best treatment. Passengers in the other vehicle, a young mother and her son, were not so lucky. Still, it was a miracle that I survived. The impact was right behind our car's driver's door, right where I was sitting. I should have been crushed. But I did not emerge completely unscathed from the incident. My face was shredded by broken glass and twisted metal. My larynx battered to permanently alter my voice. My eyes damaged such that I was declared legally blind. Though losing the majority of my sight was probably for the best, as I was unrecognizable. With extremely powerful glasses, I was able to see just enough of my reflection to recoil in horror. The only time that I've ever felt brave enough to look into the mirror with them on. My parents found me sobbing in the restroom and calling myself a monster that morning. A few days later, they told me we were moving away. That they were wanting to avoid me having to return to school and the onslaught of difficult questions or cruel ridicule from the children that knew me before. Clear across the country, we went from west coast to east, leaving everything behind, including all of the photographs of me taken prior to the accident, which my mother and father explained they did as a kindness, to avoid any reminders of how I used to look. We were starting a new life, and they seemed intent on addressing the accident and my disfigurement from it as little as possible. In fact, it seemed at times they wanted to pretend that it never happened. My mother sustained some superficial damage as well, but she became expertly adept at hiding her scars with makeup. And both of my parents refused to elaborate to anyone that inquired about my injuries, other than to say we were in a car wreck, that I was a perfectly normal little boy whose physical wounds shouldn't define him, and that they would discuss it no further. Often I appreciated their attitude, as they worked fiercely to ensure that my childhood was no different than any other, but there were days that I wished they would at least be willing to talk to me about it. Like the night that I first heard the voice. 6 months after the accident, we were settled into our new home, and I wasn't quite yet adjusted to my surroundings. So it was not a surprise when I awoke in the pitch black of my room at some point in the middle of the night. Without my glasses, I wasn't able to see the numbers on the clock to tell me exactly what time it was. But the chirp of the crickets outside my window and the absolute absence of light told me that it was well beyond my bedtime. And it wouldn't have mattered much if I could see the clock anyway, as I was unable to turn my head to face it. My body was frozen. No matter how much effort I exerted, I couldn't even wiggle a finger. I was petrified. My breaths came rapidly and I tried to call out for my parents, but my vocal cords refused to vibrate. And then I heard it. "Who are you?" A childlike whisper grated through my head. A voice simultaneously familiar and completely foreign, originating from somewhere in the depths of my brain. "What?" I replied in thought, still unable to speak aloud. "You shouldn't be here." It sounded just as frightened as I was, trembling, near to tears. Then, without warning, my left arm moved. Absent my command or me willing it to do so, I felt it raise up off the bed and ball its hand into a fist. Open and closed, open and closed. The fingers curled in and out as if trying to grasp something in the air. "You shouldn't be here," the voice screamed at me, and in an instinctual self-preservation, I yelled back at it in my mind. "Stop! Leave me alone!" Willing it to go away with every ounce of strength in my tiny body, and my arm fell back to my side. Then, suddenly, as quickly as it had come on, my paralysis lifted. Sweating profusely, I threw the covers off and ran from my parents' bedroom as quickly as I could. One small benefit to my new condition was that I could navigate much more easily in the dark than others. Most days I didn't even bother with my glasses as they gave me a headache, and I got very used to finding my way without the benefit of sight. The route from my room to my mother and father's was already memorized. I was shaking them awake less than a minute after regaining my mobility. It wasn't easy for me to explain to them what had happened as they were having to translate the hysterical words I managed to gasp out through fierce hyperventilation. But eventually they pieced together my story of the voice and how I briefly lost control of my body. I expected that they'd be scared too, that they might even take me to the hospital, yet I was shocked when they barely reacted. It's not as if they were cold and uncaring. They did comfort me. My mother rubbed my back while my father described sleep paralysis, saying that that was very likely what I had experienced. And they kept repeating that it was a perfectly normal thing. Even as a young child, I could tell there was something wrong with their logic. Dad noted that sleep paralysis could involve hallucinations, accounting for the voice, and a loss of motor function, accounting for me waking up frozen. However, it didn't elucidate how my arm had moved on its own, or the strange grasping motion it kept repeating. He had no answers for that, other than to tell me that I was okay, that I was safe, that the voice hadn't hurt me, and that the worst part of the experience was only the fear it induced. But he did warn me that it might happen again. And with his warning, he tendered some advice. If the voice comes back, and you find that you're not in control anymore, just do exactly what you did tonight, okay? Tell it to go away, and that you're in charge, he said. And with no other guidance or plans on how to deal with it, when it did return again and again, that's exactly what I did. As I grew, I learned to live with it. Neither of my parents were willing to discuss it beyond the first night other than to reiterate my father's instructions, and it only infrequently impacted my existence. By the time I was 12, I had heard it on 9 different occasions, always at night, always waking me from a deep sleep. The physical manifestations were identical each instance. Complete immobility other than my phantom arm grasping at the air. But the phrases it wormed through my mind changed. Not fair. Leave. Your fault. Stolen. However, every time, it looped back around to, you shouldn't be here. And though on each intrusion, I was able to fend it off by telling it to leave and that I was in control, every occurrence resulted in pure terror for me. No matter how many times my parents repeated that it was sleep paralysis and there was nothing to fear long term, I was still worried that one day it might take over for good. That one day I would become a passenger in my own body, especially considering that I didn't understand why it was happening. As I mentioned, I didn't have any memories from before the accident, but I was certain that it had never happened before then. I surmised that there must have been something about the wreck that triggered it, and it wasn't until 5 years after it happened that I first heard the term survivor's guilt. My mother was watching a daytime talk show and they were interviewing guests that had survived traumatic accidents, one of whom described something similar to what I was experiencing. A voice in their head, nagging them for still being alive when others had died. Listening to their story, I found myself empathizing with them. Maybe, subconsciously, I was punishing myself for causing the accident by distracting my mother. Maybe you shouldn't be here, was the voice telling me that I shouldn't be alive when it was my fault that other people weren't. But it wasn't a perfect fit for everything the voice said. What did it mean when it told me to leave or said, stolen? It was more difficult to view those words with the lens of survivor's guilt. Yet it was the best theory I had, and the one that I carried until I was 15. Until I met my best friend Carl in freshman homeroom. The first real friend that I made after the wreck. He didn't care how disfigured my face was or that I couldn't see. A bit of an outcast himself, we quickly bonded, and I shared everything about myself with him, including the details of how I received my injuries, and of the whispers in my head. My father had told me explicitly that I should never speak about the voice to anyone else. Really, he told me never to speak of it at all, but especially not to mention it outside of our house. However, I trusted Carl implicitly. He'd told me about his struggles at home, about his mom's drinking and his dad's neglect. I didn't think it fair to hold back any details of my life from him. So it was Carl that gave me my second theory on the origins of the voice, as he didn't agree that it was a simple case of survivor's guilt. He suspected an attachment. Carl was much more into the world of dark and creepy than I was. He suggested that the spirit of the boy that had perished in the other vehicle may have searched for the nearest living body it could find after it had been ripped from its own and crept inside. In his words, inhabitation was a much better explanation for what was happening to me than survivor's guilt. And for the first time, I considered that, possibly, what I was hearing wasn't a manifestation from my own mind, but was someone else speaking with me. It would explain why the voice hadn't aged with me over time. Why every night that it returned to me, it still sounded like a scared and angry child. And I had to admit that every phrase the voice had uttered made more sense when viewed from that angle. We theorized that the boy's soul didn't understand what had happened to it. That on nights when I was particularly vulnerable, fast asleep and emotionally peaceful, it could push me aside and briefly gain control of my body. That it was confused and thought I was the intruder. "Leave. Stolen. You shouldn't be here." But though it illuminated why the voice might be saying some of the things that it was, our hypothesis also pointed to a grim conclusion. The boy wanted me out. My fear of one day becoming a guest within my own body grew. Previously, I'd worried that it was just my own brain that would disconnect its physical control from my mental directions. But now I pondered the frightful possibility that there was a spirit trapped within me that was actively trying to take over. However, in addition to the dread, the prospect also filled me with a deep sadness. As the voice had forcefully reminded me several times, it was my fault that it was in this situation. I had distracted my mother. I had caused the accident. It would still be happily residing in its original host, if not for me. I asked Carl if there was anything we could do to try and free it, surmising that sending it on would be preferable for it than forever residing in an alien world. He recommended that we try a Ouija board, thinking that we could contact the imprisoned soul and help it comprehend what had happened. Thinking we might even be able to get it to leave once it realized that it did not belong in this world anymore. Yet, over the next 3 years, we made more than 50 attempts to communicate with the spirit directly, resulting in more than 50 failures. No matter the time of day, the ambiance we set, the music, the scents, the incantations, the boy would not speak to us. But he still came to me at night. 8 more visits during those 3 years, each time angrier than the last. "Leave! Stolen! Mine!" And each time he became harder to push out. Each time he held control for longer. Carl was sleeping at my house during the most recent episode, and was nearly killed when he attempted to stop the possession. He had awoken to the distressed noises of me struggling for power over my faculties, and saw my arm rise from the bed, making the repetitive squeezing motion I detailed to him. Knowing what was happening, he tried to shake me from the trance, but was unsuccessful in rattling me free. And then, I witnessed my own body attack him. Throttling blows landed on Carl's chest and face. I sprang from the bed and pinned him to the floor. Hands that I couldn't stop wrapped themselves around his throat and began to crush down on his windpipe. "Leave! I'm in control! Leave! I'm in control!" I shouted inside my head, desperately trying to regain power over my fingers before the life drained from Carl's face. And mercifully, I felt my grasp begin to loosen just as his eyes were rolling back in his head. Collapsing onto the floor next to Carl, I heard him coughing and gasping for air while the voice screamed a final, defiant appeal before it receded to the depths of my consciousness. "Give it back!" Neither Carl nor I slept the remainder of that night. I apologized over and over for what I'd done to him, but he told me that it wasn't necessary. He knew that it wasn't really me that had attacked him. Yet he began to withdraw from our friendship. Up to that point, I think Carl had found my affliction to be a curiosity, something fun and mysterious to investigate. However, the attack had exposed the true reality of it to him, and he became just as afraid of it as I was. And any time that I asked him to hang out after that night, he made an excuse. The voice took the only real friends that I had in the world, and it made me furious. 11 years had passed since the accident. 11 years the voice had been punishing me for my mistake. I needed to be free of it. So I decided to share my story online on several paranormal forums, asking if anyone could help, looking for a medium or maybe even an exorcist that could pry the unwelcome spirit from me. And yesterday, someone responded. "I've been looking for you," began the cryptic message in my inbox. "It's not a spirit you're hearing." Below those words, 2 photographs were pasted. One of my parents with me before the accident, and one of the young woman with 2 boys. A screaming face flashed through my mind. The young woman moments before her car impacted ours. And here she was again, smiling with her sons flanking her on either side. The older boy I didn't recognize, but the younger was familiar. I flicked between the 2 photos and realized how similar my younger self looked to her younger son. Similar age, similar hair color, similar eye color. We might pass for brothers too. But it wasn't just our similarities that bothered me. It'd been over 10 years since I'd looked into a mirror with my glasses on. 10 years since I'd seen my face clearly. Or was it his face? I closed my eyes and forced the blurry image from that morning up out of the depths of my memories, and my pulse quickened when it came into focus. Beneath the heavy scarring, under the swelling and bruises, it wasn't the face of the boy with my parents reflected back at me. It was his. Shaking, I took my laptop with me to the nearest bathroom and looked at myself directly for the first time in a decade. Then, maximizing the image of my mother and her boys on the screen, I imagined what the younger would have looked like, aged 18. And he stared back at me in the mirror. That moment, a splitting headache ripped through my skull, and I dropped to the floor. Grasping my head, I shrieked in pain while a series of images cascaded through my brain. I was seeing the accident again, though not from my perspective. I was seeing it from his. My mother's car flew into the intersection, and it was too late for his mother to stop. She screamed and reached for the back seat where he was seated, and he stretched forward with his left hand to grab her arm. He was closing his fist to squeeze it, just as the impact threw her through the windshield. And an instant later, everything went black. He awoke in the hospital weeks later, but was no longer the one in charge of his body. A new director had been installed. I'd been installed. The boy could hear my thoughts. He could see my memories. He knew an invader had taken control of his life, but he was powerless to do anything about it. And he watched as a man he didn't recognize shook hands with a surgeon, thanking him for saving his son's life, thanking him for being willing to perform such a radical procedure in order to do it. As the pain in my head began to wane, and the scene from the hospital was replaced with the bathroom tile I'd toppled onto, I finally understood what the voice was. I understood what my father had done. I understood why my parents had never taken me to a doctor or to therapy to address the voice. Why they had been so firm in their assertions that I tell it that I was in charge whenever it returned. They already knew what it was. In the boy's memories, it was a neurosurgeon that my father was shaking hands with. They were old friends. He was the one that saved my life, though he'd only saved part of me. The other boy hadn't perished that day, as they'd all lied to me. I had. All but my brain, which they transferred to the surviving boy's body. He wasn't the intruder. I was. Lying there on the cold bathroom floor, my mind reeled with the horrifying truth that it was now burdened with. I'd made the boy a prisoner in his own body. Sobbing, I pulled myself to my feet and looked again at the anonymous message that had shattered my reality. And I found a few more short sentences beneath the photos. You killed my mother. You stole my brother's body. I will find you. I don't know what to do. I can't eat. I can't sleep. I crushed my glasses last night, never wanting to catch even a glimpse of my face again. I thought about trying to share control with my roommate, but beyond having no idea how to go about that, I'm terrified of what he'll do if I give him the reins. Because now that I know for sure he's in there, now that I know the voice isn't survivor's guilt or a wayward spirit, I can feel him. He's stewing there, in the back of our head. Scared, furious, mutinous. He knows his brother is looking for him, and he's fighting to take over. Every night my entire town locks down for 12 minutes. I finally learned why. Written by BadandyTheRed. You know the kind of town where everyone knows everyone? Where the local diner serves coffee in mugs stamped with your name, and everyone will lend a hand to a neighbor in need? A place where generations of families grew up together? Well, that is the sort of place where I live. Sure, it is a bit rustic. Hell, I barely have reliable internet. But it is nice enough for us. It's the kind of place where time feels like it's standing still. Except for one thing. The nights. The nights are a little different here. I've lived here all my life, and there's no place I'd rather be. Or at least that's what I used to think. This place has its quirks, like any small town, but there's one big one that stands out for us. You see, every night, without fail, at 11:38 p.m., the town locks down. I'm not talking about just closing up shops and less people being out and about. I'm talking about a real lockdown. Doors slam shut and are barred, windows rattle and lock, and everyone knows they have to be inside and stay inside, at least for what happens next. The next part is strange. No one ever sees anything moving out there directly, but we all just know. We just know that somehow something outside is trying to get in. An eerie silence falls over the streets. It's like the whole town is holding its breath. Then in 12 minutes exactly, it is just over. I've always wondered why it happens at exactly 11:38 p.m. People here don't talk about it much, but when they do, they whisper. They say it's just the way things are, that it's been happening for as long as anyone can remember. But I know better. I've seen it. Whatever it is. The first time I noticed it, I was still pretty young. I think I was 10 or 11. I'd stayed up late reading some of my favorite comic books. My parents warned me, like many other kids in town, that we had to go to bed early. But if we did get up, then absolutely no leaving the house or leaving any windows or doors open. I was not asleep, but I was still following the rules when I heard the strangest sound. It was a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. I looked out the window, and that's when I saw it. The streets were empty, but there was a presence. It's hard to describe. It wasn't a person or an animal. It was something else. Something that didn't feel like it belonged. It moved with this strange, jerky motion, like it wasn't entirely in control of its own body. It radiated a disturbing sense of distortion that made my head hurt, and my eyes had a difficult time focusing on it. I could feel this overwhelming sense of hunger that made my skin crawl. Before I knew it, it was over. It had passed my house, and I realized that I had been staring out my window in a hypnotic daze. It was almost midnight, and I went to sleep, and did not tell my parents about the disturbing thing I had seen. I didn't see it again for years, but the feeling never left. Every night at 11:38 on the dot, when the town shuts down, I know it is there. We all try to act like it's not. Just behave like we have a strict curfew and that nothing is really out there. Yet the people who are too bold or foolish and think that it's nothing, well, they don't last long. Those of us who are still here know that whatever that thing is, it's out there, stalking, hunting, looking for anything, an open window, a cracked door. Disappearances are frequent, especially for such a small town. The police have a whole song and dance for anyone who goes missing from the outside. But when it's a resident, well, it is more of a case where the families of the victims are reprimanded for not having known better. No one knows why the window of time is so mercifully brief. Almost just as suddenly as it starts, it's over. By 11:50 p.m., the streets are quiet again, and the town feels normal. But it's not normal. It never was. People here have learned to live with it. They lock their doors, shut their windows, and pretend it's not happening. I asked my parents why we don't just move, and they never give me a good answer. All they said was,
"It wouldn't do any good. We have to endure. It has to be here. It is safer for everyone if it's here."
It did not make sense. I know people can get attached to places, but it felt crazy to me. I couldn't just pretend this was normal. Not after what I saw. Not after what I felt. There was something out there, and it was worse than anyone would believe. It was just recently that I saw it again. It was a normal night, at least as normal as nights could be in my town. I was getting ready to go to bed when I noticed that my cat Quincy was missing. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find him. Then I heard something and looked through the window to spot a familiar shape, and my heart sank. He was outside. He must have gotten out when I had come home earlier and was sauntering along the sidewalk. clueless to the impending danger. The time was 11:36 p.m. I had no idea if the creature had did anything to animals, but I did not want to find out. I'd never let Quincy outside before, and he did not come back to my shouted calls for his return. I had to do something dangerous and stupid to save him. I rushed outside, sprinting toward him and trying to grab him and bring him in before it was too late. I managed to reach him and pick him up, but then I froze when I sensed a presence as I was scrambling back to my door. Quincy's ears folded back and he hissed. I felt paralyzed, and then I thought I saw it again. It was different this time, larger and more overwhelming than before. Its presence seemed to fill the entire street, pressing against the houses like an unseen force. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, my breath caught in my throat. To my horror, it seemed to finally regard me. Quincy jumped out of my hands and ran back to my house. He had fortunately evaded whatever interest the thing might have had with him. The creature's head twisted unnaturally in my direction, its distorted features coalescing into more recognizable shapes. Staring into the grotesque visage forced a scream out of me as I beheld the blasphemous impossibility. I turned and sprinted away, screaming like a maniac, my heart hammering against my ribcage with such force that each beat felt like it might crack my chest open. The sound of its pursuit echoed behind me, a wet slapping noise like a monstrous jellyfish gliding across the ground. Its deafening roar filled the air, shaking the ground beneath my feet as I ran for my life. I didn't know if I could get away. No one I knew had been outside and survived. I ducked into an alley, my hands shaking as I pressed myself against the wall. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, and I could feel sweat dripping down my face. I didn't dare look around the corner. I didn't dare move. And then I heard the harrowing screams. They sliced through the air, piercing and full of terror. My heart raced as I strained to see who was making them, but all I could make out were shadowy figures caught in the open. The screams were short, sharp, and then they were swallowed by the night. The deafening silence that followed only added to the fear weighing down on me. I stayed, pressed against the wall, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. The darkness seemed to come alive with every creak and rustle, amplifying my fear. I held my breath until I heard the sound of the creature moving away. And then, just like that, it was gone. But the eerie stillness lingered, haunting me even after the clock struck 11:50 p.m. The streets were once again quiet, but my nerves were still on edge. I stumbled back to my house, every step feeling like a race against time. Quincy waited anxiously at the door and bolted inside with me, seeking shelter inside. The horrible night had left me shaken, but grateful to be alive. Whatever that thing is, it does not belong in this world. It is not of this time or place, and its presence is so unsettling, it makes your mind ache just to catch a glimpse of it. No one can tell you its origins. Maybe they are lost in the depths of history. But whatever its history, it remains. Always there, lurking in the shadows every night, without fail. At that point, I did the one thing you probably think everyone should have done by now. I left my hometown. I moved to the largest city I could reach to get away from it all. My parents did not approve. In fact, they tried to tell me I could not go. I was so desperate to get out of there. I had to sneak away in the early morning when they could not interfere. I never understood why we all stayed there and tried to ignore the eldritch nightmare that hunted us at night. It seemed so simple, and I felt better at first. The city felt alive with the hum of traffic and the distant chatter of people during the day, a cacophony that made me feel safe, anonymous. Indeed, I thought I'd left the nightmare behind, that the creature was just a memory, a relic of a past I could bury. My new apartment is a cozy studio on the 5th floor, with a view of bustling streets below, high enough where looking out the window does not fill me with dread at night. Unfortunately, something happened last night that has shattered the fragile illusion of my peaceful transition. On the first night in my new place, I sat on the edge of my bed, flipping through a magazine to distract myself from the creeping unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach. The clock on the nightstand read 11:28 p.m. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the creature was gone, that I was safe now. But the weight of the past lingered, a shadow in the corner of my mind that I couldn't shake. By 11:38 p.m., the city outside my window was eerily quiet. The usual sounds of traffic and distant music had faded, replaced by an unsettling stillness. I tried to settle on the magazine, but my eyes kept drifting toward the window, the darkness beyond the glass pressing in on me. And then, I heard it. A soft, tentative tap against the pane. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, the magazine slipping through my fingers and falling to the floor. The sound was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a chill coursing through my veins. I told myself it was nothing, I was just being paranoid. But then it came again. Another tap, this time more insistent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My eyes were fixed on the window, the darkness beyond it seeming to pulse with a life of its own. The tapping stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a faint scratching sound, like claws on glass. My heart sank. I knew that sound. I knew what it meant. Slowly, with my legs trembling beneath me, I rose from the bed and approached the window. My hand reached for the curtain, hesitated, and then, with a deep, shaky breath, I pulled it back. What I saw made me freeze in terror. The creature was perched on the fire escape outside my window, its twisted form silhouetted against the moonlit sky. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its presence seemed to fill the room, pressing in on me with an unspeakable horror. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The creature's head tilted to the side, its gaze locked on mine, and I felt a wave of dread wash over me. It was here. It had followed me. And then, as if in slow motion, its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it let out a low, guttural growl. The sound shattered the paralysis that held me in place. I stumbled back, my voice finally breaking free in a raw, terrified scream. The creature's form seemed to blur and shift, its presence filling the room with an unspeakable darkness. And then, everything went black. I regained consciousness, and I know it's not over. There is no escape from this thing that has followed me. I consider what my parents had said when I asked them why we never moved. Then, with the dawning horror, I realized the truth of their words. It is safer for everyone if it's here. They did not mean it was safer for us. They meant it was safer for everyone else. They knew the danger. They stayed to keep it here. Now, in my ignorance, I have made a huge mistake. Somehow it knew I left. It has followed me here, to a place where over 1 million people will soon know about its existence, and maybe more of it if it moves beyond that. I am so sorry for bringing it here. I didn't know. Please, for your own safety, stay inside between 11:38 p.m. and 11:50 p.m. By now, it might not be safe, wherever you are as well. The animals sought refuge in my house during a blizzard. I think they were running from more than just the cold. Written by 11 velociraptors. I barely made it home in time. 1 minute I was singing along to the radio, and the next I was staring slack-jawed at the most menacing storm clouds I'd ever seen. As someone born and raised in Vermont, I was no stranger to snow squalls, but there was something foreboding about the dark clouds blowing in from over the mountains. After reaching the house, I opened my car door and stepped out into a cold evening. The wind lashed at my face and made a terrible howling in my ears as I raced up the steps and slipped through the front door to my house. "Just in time," Luke said to me in greeting. My husband was standing in front of the living room window, surveying the mountains beyond our city. By the time I walked over to him, I could barely see 2 streets down. Seemed like we would be spending the evening inside. "Came out of nowhere," I commented. Before I so much as set down my bag, I heard the doggy door open. We didn't own any pets, but we often entertained visits from a neighborhood cat who Luke had named Rigatoni. Sure enough, an old orange cat soon appeared in our living room, leaving a trail of muddy paw prints as she trotted over to Luke. "Ah, the serial couch surfer returns. Too cold out there for you?" he asked the cat, currently rubbing her head against his shin, who meowed as if in affirmation. Tony wasn't terribly fond of most people, but Luke had a way with animals. He reached down to pet her, eliciting a melody of purrs from the contented cat. "Come on," he said, standing. "I'll fix you some dinner." "Thank God, I'm starving." "I wasn't talking to you," Luke said with a warm laugh, walking into the back of the house to fetch some cat food for Tony. Half an hour later, just as Luke and I had finally sat down to eat, we heard the doggy door open once again. I raised a brow at my husband. Tony was our only regular 4-legged visitor, so I wondered who else could have just let themselves inside our home. I didn't have to wonder for long. Seconds later, a border collie tore into the dining room, barking and whining with urgency. Luke and I both rose sharply from our seats at the table, watching the dog as it came to a stop in the corner of the room. I realized, as the poor creature lowered its head and tucked its tail between its legs, that I recognized it. "Hey, that's Mrs. Johnson's dog," I said, rounding the table to check if the dog was hurt. "Tucker? Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I see her walking him all the time." I crouched down next to Tucker and slowly reached out my arm. To my surprise, The usually sweet-tempered border collie pulled its lips back in a snarl, lunging forward slightly and snapping his teeth. It was a warning, not an attempt to actually hurt me, but I backed off all the same. Luke shot me a worried look. He's, usually more mild-mannered. I'll give her a call and let her know he's with us. Luke left the room to grab his phone while I studied Tucker from a safe distance, looking for signs of injury. His frantic barks had been replaced by occasional mournful whines. He was no longer racing around, seemingly content with his place in the corner. But his posture remained fearful and defensive. It was hard to tell with the way he was cowering, but I saw no visible wounds on him. "Do you have a signal?" Luke shouted from another room. I dug my phone out of my pocket to check, and to my surprise, I didn't. We generally had reliable coverage, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd lost cell service. I tried restarting my phone, walking around to different spots in the house, and turning airplane mode on and off. Nada. Unfortunately, it was affecting both of us. It was probably an issue with our service provider, meaning there was little we could do. I was about to ask if he still had Wi-Fi on his phone when a light but urgent tapping sound filled the room. I listened for a moment, trying to place the origin of the sound, and soon traced it to the bathroom. Or, more specifically, the bathroom window. When I got there, I saw a small, fuzzy animal standing on the windowsill and scratching fervently at glass. What in the world? The little creature didn't seem to notice my presence. I took a few steps further into the bathroom, and I realized as I approached that the animal had torn right through the windscreen. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, no nothing. At least the lights are still on. Luke trailed off as he entered the room, looking over my shoulder at the frantic creature. "Is that a weasel?" I asked my resident animal lover, who shook his head. "Pretty sure it's a marten." "Neat." I was about to compliment his identification skills before I looked over and saw the look in his eyes. "Don't ask me what I think you're about to ask me." "Oh, please. They're endangered, you know." "This isn't Noah's Ark, Luke. We can't shelter every animal in Vermont." I swear the rodent took a break from ripping through my window screen to glare at me. I glared right back. Besides, this little fucker here looks rabid. Luke and I spent a couple of minutes arguing. I wasn't keen on taking in any more impromptu guests, but Luke was adamant on saving it from the storm. "There's something off about how desperately it's trying to get in," he said. "It might be on the verge of freezing to death or something." After a while, he convinced me to take pity on the marten. I had to admit, the way it was throwing itself against the glass was a little unsettling. Reluctantly, I opened the window and allowed it to squeeze through the hole in the screen. However, I didn't realize that the marten wasn't the only creature waiting to get inside. Before I could shut the window, a flurry of about 20 mice surged into the bathroom from the hole. They must have been sitting on the sill as well, but I guess I overlooked them, mistaking their fluffy white bodies for snow. I jumped backward, swallowing a shriek as one of them landed right on my foot. Eventually, I managed to shut the window without stepping on any mice, but not before a red bird, a cardinal, I think, squeezed its way in as well. Stunned, I hurried after the animals as they made a beeline for the center of the house. When I entered the dining room, I saw not only Tucker and the animals who had just burst in through the bathroom, but also a cat and 2 dogs that I didn't recognize. Cursing, I realized that they must have entered through the doggy door, so I yelled out to Luke to lock it as I tried to make sense of the scene in front of me. The animals gave each other a wide berth. The cat didn't so much as look at the mice, nor did the dog seem at all interested in the cat. All of them were cowering, shivering as they pressed themselves into corners or squeezed into whatever hiding spot they could find. The dogs whined, the mice squeaked, even the cardinal was making a strange, almost mournful-sounding chirping noise. The only one who was behaving normally was Rigatoni, who I had to shoo away from the troop of mice hiding under the china cabinet. "What the hell is going on?" Luke asked, and I had no explanation to offer. We'd had nasty storms before, but never had I seen one inspire such desperation in our local wildlife. After another failed attempt at coaxing Tucker out of his corner, I made my way to the living room and stared out the large window. A total whiteout stared back at me. I could only see a few feet out in every direction before the world was swallowed up by darkness and snow. It was eerie, but it was beautiful in a strange way. Hypnotic. It was easy to lose myself in thought as I watched the snow fall. What could have spooked the animals so much? I wondered. Could it really be the cold alone? The weather hadn't seemed all that bad. Sure, it had been cold outside, but not blizzard cold. When I had opened the bathroom window, I'd been distracted by the mice. But when I thought about it, I didn't remember a freezing cold wind sweeping into the house alongside our animal guests. I raised my arm, pressing the back of my hand against the glass, and then stilled. "Lou?" I quietly called out. He appeared around the corner seconds later, Tony cradled in his arms. "Is it just me, or is the glass warm?" Luke stepped closer, shifting to hold the cat in one arm and placing his free hand against the pane. He didn't respond, but the way his mouth set into a thin line told me that he felt the same thing. What does this mean? I don't know. We both stood in silence for a while. The wind howled outside, but I had the sense that if I opened a window and stuck my hand out, it wouldn't feel cold. I didn't want to find out, though. Opening any windows or doors at that point seemed like a bad idea. In fact, I was about to check that all entry points to our house was secured when Luke pointed at something outside. A large, black mass ambled its way towards us. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Its shape and gait were so strange that I thought I was looking at a brand new animal. But once it stepped fully into the faint glow emanating from the porch light, I realized that it was a black bear. Its lower jaw and one of its hind legs had been ripped off, and from the trail of blood it left in its wake, it was clear that the wounds were fresh. The bear stumbled closer, stopping only inches from the glass, and with every weary step, I could make out another laceration on its body. I watched in horror as the massive creature stared directly at us with a look in its eyes that could only be described as pleading. I held its gaze for a few seconds, and then the creature collapsed onto its side. A puddle of dark red pooled outward from its body, and soon the strained expansions and contractions of its ribcage ceased. Never once did it look away from us as it bled out and died. There was a long silence before Luke and I dared to speak. "You think," Luke began, You think that's what all the animals were afraid of?" "I hope so. But something in my gut told me that it wasn't. After all, even if that was the creature they'd been running from, the question still remained. What could have inflicted that level of trauma on a black bear of that size? "I think we should get away from the windows." As we made our way to the middle of the house, the lights flickered once, twice, and then abruptly went altogether. We were plunged suddenly into darkness, and it seemed to put the animals even more on edge than before. Their squeaks and whines increased in volume as I procured 2 flashlights from our kitchen cabinet. I handed one to my husband, and then the 2 of us took to the dining room, sitting on the floor with our backs against one of the walls. Luke was calm on the surface, but I could tell that the strangeness of the situation was causing him distress. At least Tony's presence seemed to bring him some peace of mind. For some reason, she was unaffected by whatever ailed the others. I studied her as she relaxed in Luke's lap, her eyes closing as he absent-mindedly stroked her fur. Why was it that she was unafraid? She'd come into our house right before the blizzard settled in, whereas the rest of the animals had likely been outside for longer. Had they seen something out in the storm? If they had, could it have been the same thing that killed the bear? "Hey," Luke's shaky voice broke through my thoughts. "Do you hear that?" I didn't hear anything. And then I realized I didn't hear anything. No wailing of the wind. No sounds from the animals. Nothing. It was like the whole world had suddenly gone quiet. I looked around the room. All of the animals were so still. It was as if they were afraid to move. I clicked my flashlight off, wanting to attract as little attention as possible, and Luke followed suit. For a moment, we just sat there in the dark, listening. And then I heard a voice. "Hello?" Clear as day, the voice of a person was calling to us from outside our house. "Hello? Anyone in there?" it asked, its tone far too nonchalant for someone weathering the full brunt of a blizzard. "I need some help out here." Next to me, Luke shifted as though he were about to stand up. I reached out and grabbed a hold of his arm, grabbing Tony and pulling Luke back down to the floor. There wasn't a chance in hell I was about to let him investigate the voice. It was so strangely quiet that I could hear the crunching of footsteps in the snow as the person outside moved. "Please?" the voice said. It had gotten closer, like it was circling the house. "Please, I really need help. Can I just come in for a minute? It's so cold out here." My grip tightened on Luke's arm, the complete lack of emotion in the voice's tone sending a chill up my spine. He reached over, holding my hand in his as the source of the voice moved ever closer. "Come on now. Don't you have room for one more?" It was right outside the dining room window. I closed my eyes like a coward, not wanting to see whatever was about to step into view. Next to me, there was a single, sharp intake of breath. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. And then there was a light chuckle from just outside the window. There were more footsteps, but this time they were moving away from us. They seemed to be taking the silence with them. The wind remembered itself, returning a howling vengeance in the visitor's absence. Luke's hand had gone slack in mine, but I held on to it for a long time, sitting there with my eyes shut tight. It must have been an hour before I dared to open my eyes and breathe normally again. "Are you okay?" I finally asked. No response. I tried asking again, a little louder, and still my husband didn't respond. "Luke?" When I clicked on the flashlight, I saw Luke staring at the window, his face twisted into an expression of horror I'd never seen before. His skin was pale and his body was rigid as a corpse, and try as I did, I couldn't get him to respond to me in any way. His look of sheer terror never once changed, even as I carried him to the car and drove us as fast as I could to the hospital. The doctors said it was a stroke. Of course, I was incredulous that such a thing could happen to my fit, non-smoking 29-year-old husband, but no one could offer me a better explanation. For the next few days, I waited for a recovery that never came. Then the days turned into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. While Luke regained some very minimal motor control, blinking and twitching his fingers, it was clear that he would never be the same. I became his full-time caretaker, spending my days attending to all his needs and my nights praying that he would make a miraculous recovery. As of this evening, 5 years have passed since the storm. Old Rigatoni is still alive and kicking somehow, and her visits always seem to make Luke perk up just a little bit. She's sleeping on his chest as I write this, taking care of him in her own way. I'm glad to have her around, but even though I try not to be superstitious, her presence always brings me back to the night of the blizzard. I think about Tucker, who ran away after the storm passed and was never seen again. I think about the marten, and the mice, and the bear, and the way all of them acted like they were fleeing from something terrible. I think about the look on Luke's face, and I can't help but wonder if they all saw the same thing. Maybe Luke saw something he wasn't meant to. Something that his brain had destroyed itself, trying to comprehend. I look at my husband, the love of my life, and can't help but mourn what was taken from me that night. If I had opened my eyes, if I had been brave enough to look, would I have met the same fate? What did you see? I ask him, like I have 1,000 times before. I never get an answer.